Have you ever wondered why India chose to remain neutral during the Cold War, the colossal showdown between the superpowers USA and USSR? This was a period marked by intense geopolitical tension, a time when the world was essentially divided into two camps: the capitalists, led by the United States, and the socialists, led by the Soviet Union. Amidst this global polarization, India chose a unique path, adopting a policy of non-alignment. This policy meant that India did not formally align itself with either superpower, a stance that was both controversial and intriguing. But why did India choose to tread this path of neutrality? What was the rationale behind this decision? And more importantly, what were its implications? These are questions that continue to spark curiosity and debate among scholars and enthusiasts alike. So let's unravel this intricate geopolitical puzzle together. Dive in with us as we explore the rationale and implications of India's non-aligned stance during the Cold War. The roots of India's non-alignment can be traced back to its struggle for independence. In the early 20th century, India was a nation in the throes of a monumental struggle, a struggle that was not just against colonial rule, but for the right to self-determination and sovereignty. The Indian independence movement was a testament to the nation's desire to carve out its own path, free from external influence and interference. India's journey to independence was a long and arduous one, marked by non-violent resistance, civil disobedience, and an unwavering commitment to the principles of democracy and secularism. These experiences were instrumental in shaping the country's foreign policy and its decision to not align itself with any power blocs in the post-colonial world order. As the Cold War began to take shape, countries around the world found themselves having to choose sides in the ideological battle between the capitalist West and the communist East. However, India, under the leadership of its first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, chose a different path, a path of non-alignment. Non-alignment, as envisioned by Nehru, was more than just a refusal to choose sides. It was a commitment to independence, to sovereignty, and to the principles of peaceful coexistence. It was a strategic choice that allowed India to navigate the choppy waters of the Cold War without compromising its core values and interests. India's non-alignment wasn't born out of a vacuum. It was a conscious response to the country's historical experiences and aspirations. This struggle for independence had instilled a deep desire for sovereignty and non-interference in the country's psyche. Non-alignment allowed India to protect its hard-earned independence and to play an active role in shaping the global order without becoming a pawn in the great power games of the Cold War. Thus, India's non-alignment was a strategic choice, born out of its unique historical experience and aspirations. India's non-alignment was not just a policy on paper, it was put into action in various ways. Let's take a look at some specific instances that highlight India's non-aligned stance during the Cold War era. One of the earliest instances was during the Korean War in the early 1950s. When the United Nations called for military assistance to South Korea, India declined to send troops, standing by its commitment to non-alignment. Instead, India offered to play a mediating role, promoting a peaceful resolution to the conflict. This is a prime example of how India maintained its neutrality yet remained actively involved in global affairs. Another instance that shines a light on India's non-alignment in practice is the Suez Crisis of 1956. This was a significant event in the Cold War, involving major powers like the United Kingdom, France, and Israel on one side, and Egypt on the other. Despite the immense pressure from both sides, India did not align with either. Instead, it stood firmly on its principle of non-alignment and called for a peaceful resolution to the conflict, playing a crucial role in the formation of the United Nations Emergency Force to resolve the crisis. Moving towards the end of the Cold War, in the late 1980s, India's non-aligned stance was further highlighted during the Iran-Iraq War. Despite the global divide, India maintained its neutrality and offered humanitarian assistance to both nations, reaffirming its commitment to non-alignment. All these instances show that India's non-alignment was not just lip service. It was a policy that India followed diligently, regardless of the pressures and the stakes involved. It was not always an easy path, but it was the path that India chose. A path of neutrality, peace, and diplomacy. These instances illustrate India's commitment to non-alignment, even amidst intense global pressures. India's non-alignment had far-reaching implications, both domestically and internationally. Let's dive into the international sphere first. India's non-aligned stance allowed it to keep its doors open to all nations, fostering a spirit of cooperation and mutual respect. This diplomatic flexibility led to the birth of the non-aligned movement. At the height of the Cold War, this was no minor achievement. It was a beacon of hope for nations seeking an alternative path, one that veered away from the polarized world order. India emerged as a leader among equals, advocating for peace, sovereignty, and economic development for all. Now, let's talk about the implications on India's relations with other countries. This non-aligned stance didn't mean it was isolated or aloof. Quite the contrary, India was actively engaged in fostering relations with both the Western and Eastern blocs. It navigated the choppy waters of international diplomacy with a steadfast commitment to its principles. This resulted in a unique diplomatic balancing act, where it maintained cordial relations with countries that were otherwise at loggerheads. Moving on to the domestic front, non-alignment had a profound impact. It allowed India to focus on its own development without the interference of foreign powers. This independence in policymaking was critical for a newly independent nation like India. It was free to choose its own path, chart its own course, without being tethered to the agenda of any superpower. Non-alignment also had a hand in shaping India's identity. It underscored the nation's commitment to sovereignty, peace, and self-reliance. It demonstrated India's ability to stand its ground in a world divided by power politics. The non-aligned stance was not just a foreign policy. It was a reflection of India's ethos, its worldview, and its aspirations. Indeed, India's non-alignment shaped its identity as a sovereign, independent nation in the global arena. The legacy of India's non-alignment continues to influence its foreign policy even today. This stance, born in the crucible of the Cold War, remains a defining force in India's interactions with the world. Non-alignment allowed India to foster relationships with nations across the ideological spectrum. This policy of neutrality and non-interference granted India the flexibility to engage with both the capitalist West and the communist East. It's this very flexibility that's still evident in India's foreign policy. For instance, India maintains robust relations with both the United States and Russia, echoing its non-aligned past. It's not uncommon to see India balancing its relationships, often playing a mediating role in international disputes, upholding the principles of non-alignment. In a post-Cold War world, the relevance of non-alignment might seem diminished. However, it's worth noting that the spirit of non-alignment has evolved, adapting to the changing political landscape. Today, it's less about neutrality between two superpowers and more about maintaining strategic autonomy in a multipolar world. India's non-alignment has also contributed to its reputation as a peace-loving nation. Its commitment to peaceful coexistence and non-aggression has often seen it being a voice of reason on the global stage. This legacy continues to shape India's role in international organizations like the United Nations, where it often advocates for the rights of developing nations. However, it's not all rosy. Critics argue that non-alignment has sometimes led to an overcautious approach, limiting India's ability to take decisive stands on critical global issues. Yet the merits of non-alignment, particularly its emphasis on sovereignty and independence, are hard to dismiss. As we reflect on the legacy of non-alignment, it's clear that it's more than just a historical footnote. It's a doctrine that continues to shape India's worldview, guiding its foreign policy decisions in an increasingly complex global landscape. As we can see, India's non-alignment has left an indelible mark on its foreign policy and global standing. So why did India choose to remain neutral during the Cold War? We've journeyed through the genesis of India's non-aligned policy, exploring how the nation's unique historical perspective and aspirations shaped this strategic choice. We examined how this policy was put into practice, allowing India to maintain its sovereignty and independence on the global stage, refusing to become a pawn in the geopolitical power games of the time. We also delved into the implications of this stance, the challenges it presented, and the opportunities it unlocked. We discovered how it enabled India to forge its own path, building relationships based on mutual respect and cooperation rather than coercion or dominance. Finally, we reflected on the enduring legacy of non-alignment. While the world has drastically changed since the height of the Cold War, the principles of non-alignment still echo in India's contemporary foreign policy, influencing its approach to international relations. In the complex chessboard of global politics, India carved its own path with its non-aligned stance, navigating the Cold War with a strategy that was uniquely its own.